All right. Welcome to the Tempo Community Call, September 2023. We have a somewhat short agenda, I suppose. As always, feel free to throw questions in the chat. I'll watch that a little bit. Feel free to unmute if that's your style and talk. No big deal either way. This is not a canned presentation. You're more than welcome to ask questions and have a conversation. And at the end, we'll open up the floor to anything. So if you do have some more generic questions, feel free to kind of think about those throughout the course of the meeting. I suppose I should share. Let me share my screen here, and that way we can kind of work through this agenda. All right. So 223 was released. This has been the release with the most patches, and it's been about this S3 credentials change. So it's kind of hard for us to test every single of the 1,000 different S3, authentication options, as well as Azure is kind of in a similar bucket. GCS, I suppose, as well. But anyways, in 2.2, we made a change to the way we do S3 auth, but it did break some people in ways that I do not understand because I do not know all the intricacies of S3. So we released 2.2.2. 2.2.2, though, broke a different set of people, and now 2.2.3 makes this configurable, and I believe this is the same way as Mimir is. Is that true, Mario? Mimir has a very similar option?
Yes, it's even the same config parameters, same everything.
Okay. So we added a new config parameter that lets you kind of explicitly choose one kind of auth or another, and I think this should, and it mimics Mimir. So if you use Mimir or Loki, hopefully you have a similar kind of experience there. Excuse me. And you can choose this auth type explicitly, and then the old chain of authentication or credentials works the way it has always worked. So there you go. 223 if you are interested. I suppose I should update the Helm chart. If anybody's like super excited about updating Helm charts, PRs are welcome. If not, I will get to it when I get to it. In fact, I'm going to make a note about that. All right. So 223 is out. We've had I wouldn't even call it really rocky, just this one particular issue we've kind of ping-ponged on a bit, which is whatever, kind of frustrating. It speaks to the fact that we don't have amazing integration tests on all of the different auth types on all the different backends, but I don't think that's within our realm of, sanity, basically. So here we are. We appreciate the responses from the community. Issues filed to help us track that down. TraceQL, moving on. We are currently writing a doc internally that's an extension of TraceQL. That's going to add support for arrays and KV maps, support for attributes, links, events, a lot of the things that are currently missing. And once we have what we believe is a solid set of patterns, we're going to write a big PR that's going to PR that as a design doc to the public repo and ask for comments. So we're going to come up with a set of patterns we like. We are then going to ask the community for comments, and we highly encourage you to get involved if you are invested in TraceQL. That way, we don't just start working on something that everyone hates. We want everyone to be have a voice here, and so we're going to go a first round internally. Once we have that, something we can agree on internally, we will make it external. We want those comments so we can adjust. But we've already published 2 elements of this early to get some feedback on. The first is the way we want to do arrays and KV maps. So the concept of an open telemetry attribute can be an array or a list. We want to be able to index into that list and do comparisons on the data type internal to that at that index. And we also want to be able to say kind of like a wildcard. So for all elements in this array, if any match this condition greater than or equal to 5, that would be true, essentially. So a new way or a way to access these arrays, elements of the array. We believe, of course, this is pretty standard syntax and people feel familiar with it. I think if anything is a little controversial, we talked different ways to do this part, the wildcard idea. We settled on this, but again, we want feedback, we want thoughts from the community. And the second one is the KV map. So this is like a dictionary, right, or a map. You have a string. The string is going to reference a value. So we want to be able to look up by string, of course, foo equals bar. And this is what we settled on for wildcard here. We wanted to be able to basically write a regex against that name in the event that you wanted to match a multiple. And so we settled on like the wildcard regex to essentially mean all. So please give us feedback in this issue. It's in the community. It's in the community, the community called doc. There's a link. But we are kind of outlining our next step thoughts. And like I said, there's going to be one big PR which outlines all this and is going to be another good place to kind of have a discussion with the developers and try to come to agreement as a group how we want to move TraceQL forward. So me and Marty have haggled a bit here, but I appreciate comments from anyone. The second one, I think, is a little bit more straightforward, but OTel, for unknown reasons, allows any character in a label name, which is kind of insanity, including all, I think it's all UTF-8. So like all emojis are in there, right? Period, underscore, quotes, double quotes, literally anything is a valid name of an attribute, which Tempo does not support. Like you can't have a space in an attribute right now in TraceQL. So this is what we've decided to do. If you want one of these escaped characters, one of these invalid characters, you open quotes, you type your label name with spaces or some weird characters Tempo doesn't support otherwise. Pluses or any like operator is another good one. We don't support operators in attribute names right now because we can't distinguish between an actual plus and the name. So we're going to this. Open some quotes, type in your name with all your weird characters that don't count, and then close quotes. So that's the second one we've published publicly. And another one that we are looking for comments on too. I think this one's a little bit less, this one feels more straightforward to me, but I don't know, maybe people do feel strongly about the way this would work. And then you can use pluses in names or minuses or underscore, or spaces. Cool. So like I said, this is an in work right now, just a broader thing, 2 quick previews, and we'll have this all published hopefully in the next month or so. We have a weekly meeting where we really try to hammer these out. You may be surprised to learn that extending a language is hard. Finally, for my part, before I kick it off to other folks, community contributions. We've had some really solid community contributions in the past month or two. And I really wanted to bring those to the attention of the community call, just as like an acknowledgement of some of this work being done. I don't really know these people's names, but Lassie Hells, he rewrote or he moved us from an old Azure SDK to the new one. In particular, I think I'm just super impressed with the amount of time this person spent diagnosing an issue that we never see. So they were seeing some kind of race condition on ingesters, and this went on for months. I did my best to help them, but we don't see it. I couldn't help them diagnose it. And they eventually they dug deep into the Azure SDK and found some race condition that was causing the blocks not to be flushed correctly from ingesters. And this is kind of a fun read. So if you're interested, this 2129 issue is kind of a good read, a really nice deep dive into Tempo and the Azure SDK. But this person spent a lot of time swapping us from the old to the current maintained Azure SDK, and thanks to them for putting that together for us. Secondly, Kusik Mitra. This person has added 3 TraceQL features in the past couple months. Really cool to see somebody like delving deep into the parser and the engine and the fetch layer. It's complicated. Like even I get intimidated with some changes in this level of tempo sometimes. And this developer has given us 3 really solid PRs to add status messages, to add ancestor parent operators, new structural operators, and to add a not regex as well. So really cool contributions from Kosik for Tempo. Super appreciate those. All right. With that, I will hand it over to whoever would like to discuss overrides module. And the limits, I suppose, is all wrapped up in this. Yeah.
I can go. Correct, you want?
No, feel free to go.
All right. Okay, so I think we're okay just sharing this. Okay, so the next change, it has been a major refactor to the override module. I think the override module outgrew its initial scope, and it was in need on some work to clean up how we configure and define overrides. So this refactor contains two main changes. The easier to see, the first one, is we moved the defaults, all the default overrides that you would configure right after you declare the overrides block into a default, like they're indented into a new scope called default. Pretty straightforward. I think it was a bit confusing when you were declaring these defaults weren't explicit defaults, then you would have a different file with per tenant overrides. And yeah, it wasn't really clear, and they're now scoped under defaults. And the second change, which is more impactful, I guess, when you see it, is we used to have unscoped override parameters. Like you will see in the old config here in the document, we had ingestion rate strategy or metrics generator processes. So in here, the scope of the override was implicit in the name. And that was initially okay, but we kept adding more and more and more overrides. And we ended up with some very long, funny names like metrics generator, processes, service graph, enable client prefix, and it was like 50 characters long. It was very difficult to follow when you were reading it. It was impossible to type. So what we did is simply create scopes for these overrides. So now you have, for this massive override I was mentioning, you first will have a metrics generator block. Well, all the parameters that affect the metrics generator are located. Then another block for the service graphs processor. And then within that block, any configuration that affects this specific processor. So what we hope is that they're easier to read and write. Also easier to discover. Some of the overrides are pretty self-explanatory or were self-explanatory before, like ingestion rates strategy. That clearly affects ingestion, but it wasn't. They weren't clearly grouped. Like for the, I think in the read block now, there was some parameters that weren't clear that they applied to read, and you have to go through every single one, thinking, well, does this apply to the read path or not? Now they're easily grouped in one block. So that's for the changes. All these, like the entire refactor, it's backwards compatible. So we will support the old format and scoped and without the default block. Very likely for a very long time, because this is a very big change. So don't be worried about that. And I guess eventually, at some point, we will move to the new format. There is a command on the CLI tool, tempo CLI. You can find it inside CMD, the folder, which migrates this config. So you can fit it a tempo config, and it will output the new version. The only caveat I think is worth mentioning is you have to either, if you decide to migrate, you have to either migrate everything or nothing. So what this means is you either have everything scoped with this ingestion, read, metrics generator blocks in the defaults and per tenant overrides, or you have the old format. You cannot have scoped defaults and scoped per tenant overrides. You have to choose one or the other for both files or both places you can configure those. So yeah, those are the changes. I hope it was clear enough to follow.
Yeah, something else I wanted to mention, like the biggest downside of this change is that the error messages might be more complicated. Because like how the parsing will work is we first try to parse the configuration with the new structure. If that fails, we try again with the old structure. And if that fails, we'll return the error. But we're still kind of figuring out like what the best way would be to show these errors. I had a PR up to like try to smoothen it out. But yeah, maybe a bit confusing at first.
Nice. How long are we going to support the old ones?
Next breaking release, I don't know.
Yeah,
As soon as possible, I guess. But I mean, it's not a big deal. It's just like a bit more overhead every time we add an override now.
Right. Yeah, you all should probably switch all our overrides over then, shouldn't you?
Tempo will print a warning if you use the old format. So you'll see it in the logs at startup.
Right. Okay.
I mean, yeah, we'll announce when we remove the old configuration.
Right. Cool. All right. This was always something of a mess. It's nice to see this get a bit cleaned up, have some nice structure here. I do think it's going to be kind of a hard migration internally because we have tons of, configuration, deployment configuration code built around the old way. And I guess we're going to have to migrate that all to the new way safely, which will be fun.
and that's why we're never deprecating the old way.
That's what I thought I was going to hear when I asked, when are we deprecating the old way? All right. Cool. So that's the official agenda. I'd be willing to take questions. Team would be willing to take questions about the project or about your installs or, whatever people are interested in, roadmap, future stuff. We did just have an interesting production incident. I could talk through that if people are interested in hearing kind of what went wrong and what changes we're going to make to fix it. But I'm not going to talk about it unless someone asks me to.
I would like to hear that. Sorry, I tried emoji to find the right emoji, but couldn't.
I saw your thumbs up emoji. I'm taking it. I think that counts. Thank you. All right, here we go. So I'll type in some details here, I suppose. It was on the query path. The write path was stable. But on the read path, we started seeing ooms, inquiriers, and query frontends pretty aggressively, like basically. And what it boils down to is tempo does not protect itself well on the read path, specifically from trace ID queries. And this is the change we're going to make to fix this. And I think there's two components here. One is we have a max trace size, but it is not enforced on the query path in Parquet. It was enforced on the query path in the old format in V2. But in Parquet, it's really hard to do that in Parquet because in the old format, your trace was just a bunch of bytes in one spot. It was all proto. It was really easy. Like if it was greater than a certain length, just don't return it. But in Parquet, your trace is split across thousands, hundreds of little columns, and you can't really count the size of this, right? It's very difficult. So we kind of punted on it, and we just got kind of burned on it, basically, from a customer repeatedly querying over and over again for these very large traces. So one is better large trace protection on vParquet. Right now, when you say max size is 10 megabytes, the ingestion path tries to prevent that, prevent you from going over 10 megabytes, but it's impossible to perfectly protect ourselves, right? Like if you write 10 megabytes of a trace, we would accept that. And then if you wait an hour and write another 10 megabytes of a trace, we've already flushed that old trace to the back end. So we continue to accept it. There's no real way to like scan your 30-day or 15-day or whatever day retention for a trace ID to start refusing. It's impossible. So you can always kind of push greater than you can always push more than your max trace ID or a trace size. If you do it right. So better protection on the query path. So the query side needs to protect itself because you can request too large or traces too large. The second thing that got us, and this is something I've kind of known in the back of my head needs improvement and never really had done, is the querier. Querier has a configurable number of jobs, so like number of jobs it wants to accept. Problem is, it does not distinguish between trace ID and search. Search and trace ID are the same. These are both jobs to it. So it says I can do 100 jobs or I can do 10 jobs, and the query frontend just starts throwing jobs at it and doesn't distinguish between trace by ID and search. And search jobs tend to be very small and quick. So our query path in prod is tuned to search, so people's searches are pretty quick. We want that, right? The problem is if you start slamming tons of trace by ID queries in there, looking up a trace by ID is a much heavier job than looking up a search. So when you are overwhelmed with trace by ID lookups, the queriers are trying to take on way more jobs than they can really handle, which then in turn causes them to oom. So I think the two major fixes I want are better large trace protection. We pushed a Band-Aid to prod just to get it to stop happening, and I'll turn that into a real PR soon. In fact, I have my fake PR up, or my like Band-Aid PR somewhere. We can actually look that up if y'all are interested. And then the second one is to split the concept of the two paths, the two job paths. Search, we want the query to still bring Band-Aid. Search, we still want to bring in a lot of jobs and try to do as much as possible because search jobs are tiny, like we said. But trace by ID jobs, we want it to be able to configure those independently. So do 100 search jobs, but only try 5 trace by ID jobs or something like that, right? So those are the two big fixes. I think there's also some small improvements. Just like we just noticed, the way we do our retries, for instance, doesn't really work well in some of these scenarios. So I'm going to spend some time, I think, this next month cleaning up this query path, protect ourselves better, and handle some of these like cases where tempo becomes overwhelmed on the read path better. Did that make any sense?
Yes, it did. Thank you.
Cool. No problem. Thanks for asking. All right, team. Anything else? Questions about tempo in general? What I'm going to eat for lunch? Oh, yeah, sure. Go ahead, Andreas.
Yeah, I had a question for the search API, but you kind of already answered it.
Sure.
So it was about currently, if you run a TraceQL query, you only get the spans returned, which are in the query. Mm-hmm. And I was wondering if it's feasible to return optionally the entire trace. But you just mentioned that it's a very expensive operation, which,
right.
Why is it exactly? Is it because the data is kind of split in multiple columns in the same block, so you need to process?
Right. So yeah, when we return trace by ID, it goes, or sorry, right, we have to pull it, like you said, from a lot of different columns. We actually move through a couple of different formats, which is always a problem in Go, where you have like a rich, deep object model, and then you translate it to a second rich, deep object model that tends to use a lot of memory because of all of the heap allocations. And that's a big part of what's happening. Now, I'm really excited about Go memory arenas, because I think it will be great for tempo, because tempo often has really enormous, rich objects that are, it's a trace, right? It's all tiered out, all the spans, all their attributes, and all these references we individually put on the heap, and then we tell the garbage collector, please figure out those 10,000 references now. With memory arenas, we can begin an arena, we can allocate everything, all of those elements in the trace into that arena, and then the heap can treat this as a single object. So I think memory arenas are going to be a huge win for tempo because we have the exact problem they're trying to solve. To get back to your question a little bit, we actually can return more spans on the query path, the search path, than we do. Because on the search path, we don't reconstruct the entire trace. We only look for very specific fields like duration, name. We don't build or find all the attributes. We don't care. It's only the ones you asked for, as well as a couple metadata attributes. In fact, just today, Grafana merged a PR to allow to make that configurable. Tempo right now has a parameter on the search path called SPSS, which was actually community contributed. So SPSS is spans per span set. And on API search, blah, 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 ampersand SPSS equals 30. You could ask for 30 spans per return or 50 or 100 or whatever. So that is in Grafana, like main right now. Tip of main, Grafana does this, but obviously it's not been released. So that's coming soon, where you can in Grafana say, oh, I actually want more spans per span set. And then that would allow you to start retrieving like larger and larger percentages of your traces, which I think, which I see like people wanting for sure. This is another part of my like ideas for the future. I really want to start returning to Grafana structural information. Return. I'm not going to type this. Return to Grafana structural information. So when you do a query right now, you just see like 3 spans, right? Like you see some basic metadata. I want to return enough information for Grafana to render like a small tree there. So if there's a child relationship or a descendant relationship, I want it to do its best to render that. Like a lot of times it won't be able to, but sometimes it will. And I think that will give you good information. That also will increase the value of this parameter. It would be awesome to be like, give me 100 spans if you felt comfortable with that. And then, or, like if you needed that much, and it would render a large percentage of the trace perhaps. And to give you a really cool idea of like, all right, I wrote this query, and now I'm seeing a lot about what it returned in terms of the structure of the trace, which I think is really cool. Can you get my email? Yeah, man. Sure. I think it's public. Like, I think that's it. It's not it. It's on our website, I believe. So I have a strong idea of where I want tempo search results to go. I want you to be able to ask for more and more of the trace. I want to render the trace as a trace more completely to give this kind of experience where you're only jumping into the actual trace ID more rarely when you need to see the whole thing. And most of the time, you're actually able to stay in search results and write queries that reveal like the structure of a trace and the questions you have about that trace. So I don't know. That's where I wanted to go, and we're slowly getting that direction, I think.
So from a performance point of view, would it make any sense to optionally return the entire trace back versus calling it in a loop like get by trace ID? Because I took a look at the tempo query code, and it basically just has a serial loop of querying all the traces.
Is that how? I didn't know that's how it worked. Is that how it worked?
Yeah, I think I have it open somewhere.
Sure. I'm not surprised it does that. That's terrible though. Like, because Jaeger expects you to return the entire trace on search. And so the tempo query Jaeger shim does that too. Yeah. Oh, I thought you were going to share.
Yeah, it's basically.
Yeah. I don't know. I think. Sorry, go ahead, Andreas.
No, I was just wondering if it makes sense to optionally have an attribute in the search path to return the entire trace, or if it just doesn't make sense and kind of doing it serial or probably better parallel to get it after the fact, after the search is done.
Yeah. I mean, I think Jaeger returning entire traces is a mistake on their search because it's just so much data. Like you do a search and it returns everything every time. It's slowing it down, right? And it's preventing them from doing more interesting things in their return, I think. Is actually something Yuri wanted to fix for a long time. I noticed it at some point. Everyone who's dug in Jaeger notices it eventually. And everyone wants to kind of clean it up because just so much data return. If you have 100,000 span trace and your search happens to hit it, it just blows the front end up for no reason when all it needs to really return is metadata, right? So yep. I don't think we'll grow tempo this way. If someone really wanted it and submitted a PR to do it and made it like a feature flag or just behind a parameter, I think we'd consider taking it. But I don't have interest in moving tempo in a direction where a search returns like renders and returns an entire trace. It would be quite expensive, yeah.
So I think some of the things Jaeger is rendering, for example, is if you have a search and it shows you which services are in the trace and how many errors are in the trace. Mm-hmm. So it doesn't, like only for the list, you actually don't need the entire span, but you need more metadata, like, yeah, as I said, like the number of services and like how many spans per service, and how many errors?
I think it would be more palatable to come up with a list of things we considered metadata, like that, count the errors, or count or list the services or something, right? And include that in the Parquet schema at the highest level, at the trace level, and then return that. If we needed to like decorate our metadata or make our metadata more rich, that's, I think, a better way to go about doing it. So at the highest level of the trace, we do have some metadata already. I can go find it.
For example, duration. So an additional field in the trace metadata, which has, for example, how many errors are in the trace.
Yep. So here, let me share this real fast. And it wouldn't be too terribly difficult to add. So if I go to schema, and if we look at the trace struct right here. So we already store some metadata: root service name, root span name. And then this is the trace itself. This like actually is the full thing, right? Going into it. Start time, end time. This text is just to make things a little bit easier. So here, I think we could discuss like adding, right, a count of errors or a list of the services that participated in the trace, essentially. I would be a little concerned about it. I think maybe we would put a limit, like in case somebody had some crazy trace with 10,000 services, we'd maybe have a way to like stop accumulating services in a list here to prevent blowing up Parquet. But I do think the idea generally is very good. And then we would, I don't even know, it's like this code here or the combine code. There's a couple places you would have to add a little like code to do the calculation, essentially. It's not as bad as you think. Really, you can kind of look for the places where we set this metadata, because we do that. I think it's during combine, and there's only two places. When we translate a proto trace to a Parquet trace is the first one. The second one is anytime we combine two Parquet traces. I think those are the only two places that you need to worry about this metadata.
And in the combine function, you have access to that information, like, for example, which services are participating. Because to get this information, you kind of need to retrieve all the spans, right?
Right. The combined function already iterates through both of the two traces. It already does the job of like, let me check every single span and every single trace and throw away duplicate spans and bring in unique spans to make sure I have a complete trace. So it's doing so much work already that adding like let me add a counter for errors or let me accumulate a couple service names is significant. It will cost nothing basically compared to what it's doing already.
Okay, awesome. Thank you.
Yep. I will say that schema changes require a new schema, unfortunately. So this would be a vParquet 4, but we are working on a vParquet 4 right now. So if Andreas, if you have interest, I think we can talk about that like as an extension. It's a good time to add something basically, like if we want to add another field. How is progress going on V3? Weeks or months away. V3 we use internally in prod everywhere, and it's fantastic. It's saved us from a couple of different incidents already. The speeds, the ability to pull out a column and put it in a unique column is amazing. It helps us on speed. It helps us on memory. It helps us on everything. It's just been a blessing, frankly. Props to Mario and Adrian, who spent months designing and building and working on that. And I expect it to be way rockier getting it into production. When Adrian was putting it in production, I was a little nervous, but I was like, okay, I trust the team. And my God, it's just been flawless. So that will be the next release of Tempo. It will be default, vParquet 3. It is default now in all of our production clusters. I think it's actually default now tip of main, frankly. And yeah, the performance improvements are amazing. Like we're scanning terabytes a second easily when you search for span level attributes that have been promoted to these distinct columns. And almost better than that, almost better than taking out the columns you want to query, it's taking out the big columns. Like you have a development team that puts a bunch of DB statements in there, and each statement is, a K, like 1K or 10K, and it's an enormous SQL query. Pulling that out and putting that in its own column makes it so much faster and so much more memory efficient on every query. So it's been one of the highlights. I'd say it's the biggest major improvement to Tempo since Parquet. It is the biggest leap we've made as vParquet 3. And it is exciting.
One question I have is what is the latency you see on your memcache configuration? For us, we see a latency of 250 millisecond on a regular basis. Do you think that's great? Because we internally are debating that's not great, but just wanted to see your opinion and what are the values you see in your infrastructures?
For sure. I'm about to go look that up right now. I'm wondering if you're seeing a lot of 250 milliseconds, if that's the timeout, like if it's capped there. I don't know what the timeout is to memcache off the top of my head.
So we updated the timeouts on our backend to a little bit higher, but I can double check that as well.
Let me double check as well. I'll look in ops and prod in a couple of our clusters and see what kind of timings I'm seeing. Let's see. Oh man, we have this giant memcache dashboard that every single team shares, so I have to go like find the tempo stuff. Here we go. Let's do tempo prod, or let's start with tempo ops actually. If anybody else on the team has thoughts here, I would love to hear them, because we have an upcoming project to dig deeper into memcache specifically, because one, we want to start doing page level caching in Parquet, which is really going to speed things up even more. And two, it's just been an area of code that works, but we haven't spent a ton of time like aggressively understanding the behavior of it. Like you're asking, what is a good amount of time? And my honest answer is I kind of don't know, because it's been so long since we have really reevaluated the way we use memcache. So that's an upcoming project this quarter, I think. So hit rate's pretty good, 100% most of the time. Some dips, not surprising, right? You do a query over a range that it hasn't cached in a while, we're going to see a dip there. Where resources? Do we not have latency?
It's in the Tempo Reads dashboard. Again, this is, I believe, the overall memcache configuration dashboard.
Oh, you're using the Tempo Reads dashboard? That's awesome. Here, let me hide my screen for a second. I'm looking at ops. Let me make sure that I'm not gonna.
No.
Oh yeah. Never mind. I thought I closed you all. I did not close you all. All right. And
Shubhanshu, are you on Kubernetes?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, I imagine there's just some balance there between like how long it takes you to pull the data from your backend compared to how long it takes you to pull the data from memcache, and kind of evaluating if that performance trade-off is worth it. And then also the calls to the backend, like if you're if it's cheaper to run memcache than it is to make the calls to the backend and pull that data, then that probably factors in.
Okay.
so here's ops. Ops is our like internal operational cluster. It does, I don't know, it does like 200, 300, 400 megaseconds somewhere. It's a huge range.
Yeah.
Off the top of my head, I don't know. I think it's around 300. Let's just say that. It's the average. Okay. So here you go. Looks like our P99 is around 100, occasionally spiking up to the 250 range. P50 is significantly lower here, 2 milliseconds or so, and it's pretty pinned down there at the bottom. Excuse me, seeing some obvious spikes when there's the big query spikes here, 7,000, almost 10,000 requests a second to memcache there. And yeah, the P50 came up to 25, it looks like, or 12, I'm sorry. And it looks like we capped for the timeout as well.
Okay.
There you go.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
One follow-up question, if I may.
Sure.
I saw your hit rates at 100%. Our hit rates, memcache hit rates, are in 70 to 80% of the range. Can you give us some pointers to get it from 70 to 80 to 100 or maybe 90s?
Sure, scale up.
Yeah.
I don't know. We don't have good sizing. That's a great question. The question is kind of like, given a retention, and given a like a rate of like a throughput or bytes received, you should be able to have you should have a decent idea of how much cache you need.
Okay.
Or maybe it's a function of blocks, right? If you have 10,000 blocks or 20,000 or 100,000 blocks, maybe that's where we calculate it. Most of the time, like I said, this is, I don't want to say ignored, but it's definitely like a lower priority because Memcache is awesome. It just works. It just does nothing but work. I love Memcache. But I think if we see it in the 60s, 70s, 80s, we just scale cache up and deal with it another day, you know?
Okay.
The one improvement we're really looking to make, though, and hopefully we can do, this is for us internally, but hopefully we can do a good job of sharing this, is the Loki team did this and they saw great results, which was moving to a disk-based memcached. So it's a lot cheaper because disk is cheaper and they use just some super fast cloud disk, basically, instead of memory. And they take a little hit on latency in exchange for being able to have way more cache, essentially, because disks are cheaper than memory, of course. And so they went through a project that reduced their TCO significantly with almost no impact on search latencies by switching over to some disks instead of using memcache memory. So that's part of what we're looking to do. Switch to disks, go to page level caching, never make a thing called a store gateway, and use memcache instead. And I think we'll see some ridiculous times in the future. Right now, I'm already impressed with how fast we can scan trace data, but I think we're going to see some even better times in the next couple months.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for answering that. I guess another question on that. Sorry, I'm asking too many things, but do you guys alert when your hit ratio go down on your memcache, or you just as part of the on-call workflows, you see, okay, it is going down, we scale it up?
We alert on SLOs.
Okay.
So like a read SLO. If our read SLO starts tanking, I don't know if engineers, would you ever look at memcached? Any engineer in here who is on tempo on call, would you look at memcached? Mario's saying, yeah, he totally would. Look at that. Look at that face. He's saying, yeah, for sure. Zach would.
No, I can't remember. I've never had to scale up memcache.
Right.
There are times where we see timeouts.
Mostly works.
Right. What I think would be the right answer to that question is maybe a critical alert would be your actual SLOs. Include in your run book. Go check memcache, see what that looks like, and then maybe a warning alert being what's my timeout, or like, am I hitting my timeouts a bunch? What's my latency on memcached? I think that would probably be a good pattern.
Okay. Perfect. Thank you.
Yeah. All right, crew. How we doing? Everybody good? Yeah, you are. It's a pleasure talking to all of you today.
Yeah,
We'll
good
see
call.
you. Yeah, thanks, Zach. We will see y'all in about a month. Thanks for the questions. Great questions today. We'll see y'all in about a month at community call. Feel free to talk in the Slack, GitHub issues, GitHub PRs, everything. Talk to us, communicate. Watch for those TraceQL PRs. We really, really want y'all's feedback on where we're moving next. And we'll see you in a month. Take care, everybody. Come to Slack. Yeah.
Bye-bye.